Kola saw a door slidedly open and he peeped in, only to find her boss, Madame Wura, undressing, but he could not persist what he saw, not knowing that Wura was looking at him, and as she stand naked and she told Kola come closer, without a word, she pulled him into a passionate kiss, a kiss that felt like nothing Kola had ever experienced. It was as though time itself had stopped, and for a moment, all that existed was the sensation of her lips on his, the sweetness of her scent, and the fire that burned between them. Kola's mind was foggy, and he couldn't remember how they had ended up in her bedroom. In the heart of the bustling city, there lived a woman named Wura, a wealthy and mysterious businesswoman. She owned a high-end salon and several real estate properties, making her one of the most influential figures in town. Her beauty was unmatched, and her youthfulness, despite her age, sparked many rumors. People whispered that her beauty was a gift from some supernatural power, something that had made her the envy of every woman in the city. Her driver, Kola, had been in her service for over 3 years. He was a quiet man, working diligently every day, his head full of hopes for a better life. He had heard the rumors about his madam, but had never been one to pry into her private affairs. Kola's life was simple, his dreams small, until one fateful evening that would change everything. It was a warm night, the kind where the city lights glittered like stars, casting an eerie glow over the streets. Kola had just finished his work for the day and was preparing to leave. However, as he walked to the car to head home, he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The front door of Madame Wura's mansion was slightly ajar, and the flickering light inside beckoned him. He heard noises, strange and unfamiliar. Intrigued, Kola hesitated, torn between curiosity and respect for his employer's privacy. But something compelled him to approach, something deep within him that whispered, urging him to discover what lay behind that door. He stepped cautiously, his heart pounding as he pushed the door open just a crack. What he saw left him frozen. There, in the center of the room, stood Madame Wura, completely naked. The sight was a shock to Kola. She was standing in front of a large mirror, gazing at her reflection as though mesmerized by the way the moonlight kissed her flawless skin. Her beauty was so striking that Kola felt an odd mixture of awe and fear. But what was even more unsettling was the aura of power that radiated from her. Madame Wura turned, sensing something, or rather, someone, lurking in the shadows. Her eyes met Kola's with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "You shouldn't have seen this, Kola," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried an undeniable force. "But since you have, perhaps you can help me. Help me keep my beauty." There was something in her tone, an invitation, a command, all at once. Kola stumbled backward, unsure whether to run or stay. His mind raced with confusion. How could his madam, the woman he had served so loyally, be so different from the person he thought he knew? Madame Wura's eyes softened, and she took a step toward him, her movements graceful, almost hypnotic. "You're curious, aren't you, Kola? You want to know how I remained so young, so powerful?" Kola nodded, unable to form words. His mind was a whirlpool of conflicting thoughts. He had heard rumors, yes, stories about strange happenings, about people disappearing after getting too close to Madame Wura. But he never imagined that his own madam could be the source of those tales. Madame Wura smiled, her eyes gleaming with something ancient, something almost otherworldly. She stepped closer to Kola, her presence overwhelming. "What if I told you that everything you've heard is true? What if I told you that I've discovered the secret to eternal youth, to beauty that never fades?" Her voice was low and alluring, and Kola felt himself drawn in by her every word. "How?" Kola whispered, barely able to control his own voice. He was in too deep now, trapped in her spell. Madame Wura's smile grew wider, almost wicked. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Come closer," she murmured. "Let me show you how powerful I am." Kola was paralyzed, both by fear and an inexplicable desire to understand more. As she reached for him, Kola's body moved on its own, as though his limbs no longer belonged to him. He was drawn to her in a way that he couldn't explain. Madame Wura's fingers gently traced the outline of his jaw, and Kola felt a rush of warmth, an electric current passing through him. It was as if her touch ignited something deep within him, something that had been dormant for years. Without a word, she pulled him into a passionate kiss, a kiss that felt like nothing Kola had ever experienced. It was as though time itself had stopped, and for a moment, all that existed was the sensation of her lips on his, the sweetness of her scent, and the fire that burned between them. Kola's mind was foggy, and he couldn't remember how they had ended up in her bedroom. Madame Wura was unlike any woman Kola had ever known. Her beauty was intoxicating, and her energy overwhelming. As they lay together, she whispered to him, her voice soft but commanding, "This is how I stay young, Kola. This is the price of eternal beauty." Her words hung in the air like a heavy spell, and Kola felt his heart race with a mixture of excitement and dread. The next morning, Kola woke up alone in Madame Wura's bed. His body felt strange, as though he had been marked by something powerful, something dark. He could still feel the lingering traces of her touch, the warmth of her skin, and the pull of her presence. But something had changed within him. He could feel it deep inside, a sense of power, of control, of submission. Madame Wura was already up, sitting by the window, her silhouette framed by the soft morning light. She turned to him, her eyes gleaming with a secret knowledge. "How do you feel, Kola?" she asked, her voice light, almost playful. But beneath that playful tone was something deeper, something darker. "I hope you're ready for what comes next." Kola sat up, feeling disoriented. He looked at her, confused. "What comes next?" he asked. Madame Wura smiled knowingly, her lips curling into a mysterious grin. "You'll see soon enough," she said cryptically. "But first, there's one thing I need from you." She stood, walking slowly toward him. "You must give yourself to me fully, body and soul." Kola was torn. He knew something wasn't right, but he also knew that he couldn't resist her. There was something about her that held him captive, something that went beyond mere physical attraction. It was as if she had a hold on his very being, an unseen force that guided his every move. And just like that, he found himself agreeing to her demands, surrendering to the power she wielded over him. Over the next few weeks, Kola found himself becoming more and more entangled in Madame Wura's web. He became her willing accomplice, running errands for her, doing whatever she asked. But with every task he completed, he could feel a part of him slipping away, replaced by something darker, something more obedient. He could see the transformation in her, too. She was growing more beautiful by the day, her skin glowing, her youthfulness seeming to increase with each passing moment. It was then that Madame Wura began to reveal the full extent of her power. She lured men into her grasp, one after another, using them to fuel her beauty and maintain her youthful appearance. Each man that fell under her spell was drawn into a cycle of devotion, unable to escape. They became nothing more than her slaves, bound to her by the force of her magic and their own desire. Kola watched in silent awe and horror as his madame's influence grew. One by one, she seduced 10 men, each one falling under her spell. They were all drawn to her, helpless to resist her charms. Kola saw them change before his eyes, their once vibrant personalities and ambitions slowly fading, replaced by a servitude that was as much physical as it was mental. Each of these men became her loyal servants, doing whatever she commanded, unable to escape the grip of her magic. They were like puppets, their lives no longer their own, bound to her by an invisible thread. Kola wondered if he too was becoming one of them, if he too would lose his will and become another of her slaves. Madame Wura's power over the men grew stronger by the day. Her beauty, ever youthful and radiant, was irresistible. But what truly captivated the men was the mysterious allure that surrounded her, the promise of something beyond ordinary life, something that could elevate them to heights they had never imagined. She knew how to seduce, how to make each man feel as though he were the only one in the world. And so, one by one, she lured them into her web. The first man to fall under her spell was Peter, a a young and ambitious lawyer who had recently opened his own practice. He was always looking for ways to climb the social ladder, but no matter how hard he worked, success seemed just out of reach. Madame Wura had noticed him at one of her business meetings, a man dressed in the finest suits, his confident demeanor only masking the deep insecurities that gnawed at him. She saw the hunger in his eyes and knew he was ripe for the taking. She invited Peter to her mansion under the guise of discussing a potential business partnership. She greeted him at the door with a warm smile, wearing a form-fitting red dress that accentuated her curves. Peter, despite his usual composure, couldn't take his eyes off her. She led him into the grand living room, where the scent of jasmine and sandalwood hung in the air, setting a relaxed yet intoxicating atmosphere. The soft music playing in the background seemed to enhance the allure of the room. As they sat down to talk, Madame Wura poured them both a glass of wine, her movements slow and deliberate, each gesture exuding sensuality. She spoke to him softly, making him feel as though he was the most important person in the world. She complimented him on his ambition, on his drive, and told him how impressed she was by his success. Peter, flattered by her attention, found himself opening up to her in a way he never did with anyone else. She listened intently, her eyes never leaving his, her gaze like a spell that made him forget everything else. Before long, Peter found himself entranced, his mind clouded with desire and admiration for the woman before him. When Madame Wura leaned in closer, her breath warm against his ear, she whispered, "You've worked so hard, Peter. You deserve more than just success. You deserve to feel powerful, eternal, beautiful." Her words wrapped around him like a silk rope, and without realizing it, Peter had fallen under her influence completely. When she kissed him, it was like the world had faded away, leaving only her touch. As the night progressed, their passion grew. In the heat of the moment, Peter didn't question her actions, nor did he wonder why he felt an overwhelming sense of attachment to her. All he could think about was the magnetic force that pulled him toward her, the power in her kiss, the fire in her touch. When the night ended, he left her mansion a changed man, his thoughts consumed by her, his ambition now intertwined with her. Peter began to visit Madame Wura more frequently, each encounter leaving him more ensnared in her web. Soon, he was doing things he would have never considered before, bending his will to her every whim. His practice, once thriving, began to fall into disarray, but he couldn't bring himself to care. All he wanted was her, and he became willing to sacrifice anything, his career, his reputation, even his freedom, to remain by her side. The second man to succumb to her charms was Donald, a wealthy businessman who owned several hotels in the city. He was known for his bravado and his unyielding control over his empire. But like many men of his stature, he had an insatiable need for more power, more admiration, more pleasure. Madame Wura saw this hunger in him and knew he would be a perfect addition to her collection. She first approached Donald at a charity gala, a place where the city's elite mingled. Her entrance was nothing short of stunning, and it wasn't long before Donald took notice of her. He was drawn to her elegance and grace, and the way she moved through the crowd with the confidence of a woman who knew her worth. When their eyes met across the room, it was as though the world had paused, and for a brief moment, it was just the two of them. Donald, a man who had always been surrounded by admirers, found himself captivated by Madame Wura. She approached him with the same intoxicating charm she had used on Peter, and soon, the two were deep in conversation. Madame Wura listened intently to Donald's tales of success, but unlike others who merely admired his wealth, she offered him something different, an understanding of his deeper desires. "You are a man who can have anything you want, Donald," she said, her voice smooth like honey. "But even with all your riches, there is something missing, isn't there?" Donald was taken aback by her insight. No one had ever dared speak to him like that before. She leaned in closer, her scent enveloping him. "I can show you how to truly live, Donald. How to have everything you've ever desired, and more." She promised him youth, beauty, and an endless supply of pleasure. Donald, always seeking more, couldn't resist the temptation. That night, he joined her in her bed, unable to fight the allure of her promises. From that moment on, Donald became one of Madame Wura's most loyal victims. His once commanding presence was replaced by an eerie subservience, and his empire began to crumble as he devoted himself entirely to her. He spent his days catering to her every need, doing whatever it took to keep her happy. She had him under her control, and nothing could break the hold she had over him. The third man to fall was Ola, a charming and ambitious artist who had recently gained recognition for his talent. He was known for his handsome looks and captivating paintings, but beneath his charismatic exterior was a man struggling to find his place in the world. His art was his escape, but even that didn't fulfill him. Madame Wura, ever the opportunist, recognized that Ola's inner void could be filled by her dark magic. She invited Ola to her mansion under the pretense of commissioning a painting. When he arrived, he was struck by the opulence of her home. She greeted him warmly, dressed in a simple but elegant gown that seemed to enhance her natural beauty. They quickly fell into conversation about art and the creative process, but as the night wore on, Madame Wura began to subtly shift the conversation, drawing him into deeper, more personal topics.